Welcome to the show, Habiba, Noor, and Miriam Sobre. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Habiba. I teach at Trinity University in San Antonio. I'm in urban studies and education. And thanks for doing this, Ryan.
Hi, I'm Miriam Sobre. I teach intercultural communication at UTSA, and I am particularly interested in critical intercultural communication pedagogy. And I'm in Ryan's department. So thanks for doing this, Ryan.
The event that y'all are putting on is called Academic Freedom in the Age of Educational Intimidation. And that just begs to be defined. Let's start with academic freedom. What does that mean to both of you?
I think what it means, academic freedom is really about creating a space where there's no restriction on thinking and learning and discussion, right? I think the premise of the idea is that we can't understand our world and create new knowledge if we have limits on our thinking. And I think that academic freedom has a deep history in the university, and it's one of the few places that really has that type of freedom, which I think is really special, and it's complicated. In many, and it's always a little bit complicated. I'm not sure if it's ever been totally free from its origin, but I think that the principle is worth holding on to and not letting it go, even if it's maybe not in practice always happening. But I like the principle. I like because I think it's really essential. And in a place like, in a space that's, where companies and corporations kind of drive so much of what happens in society. Corporations don't necessarily have academic freedoms, but universities do. And that's what makes universities special.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would go on. I would add to that as well, that I think, and I'm not sure, if we're actually living in a free society at this point, but two things that are imperative to have if you're going to live in a free society are academic freedom, or the freedom to debate and critically examine and understand and then potentially agree or disagree with large-scale concepts and theoretical ideas is a really important thing, because that allows for the continued development of ideas and framing ways of looking at things, etc. And you need a free press. And if you don't have a free press and you do not have a university system, a public in particular, and I think a lot of ways a public university system that teaches our young people how to think critically and how to learn and be able to discuss and debate ideas in an intelligent way, then when these students get out into the world, they are not going to understand the process of critical thinking. And I think it's a really important thing to note that academic freedom is not the indoctrination of students into faculty beliefs on any level. As a matter of fact, it's almost the opposite. It is teaching students how to have their own free thought and how to use that free thought to consume information in an intelligent, intentional, and critical way. And in this era that we live in of disinformation, especially around political movements and things like that, things with high stakes, if you don't have academic freedom, then you are going to have a bunch of people who aren't able to be discerning and be able to develop their own free thoughts around concepts and ideas.
So I'm thinking about the second half of the title of this event, in the age of educational intimidation. How did we get to a place where we don't want students to think critically, or we don't want certain ideas to be talked about in university life?
Okay. So, as Habiba noted, I don't think we have just gotten to this place. I think this place has always been there. Anytime you have sort of fights for the freedom of ideas, you are going to have people who want to shut that down, because the free discourse of ideas means that you can't control the narrative in the same way. Now, that being said, the current argument and sort of culture war around academic freedom and its partner intellectual freedom in K-12 as well, can, it's cyclical. I mean, we saw this during the Nixon administration. After the civil rights era, a lot of progressive academic policy was passed, and then the Nixon administration came in, appointed 4 really conservative Supreme Court justices, and we went backwards, right? And this is happening now. And there were, the way that I've seen it and studied it, there have been a series of events that have all worked together to create the climate that we're in now. But it's hard to say where that story starts, because you can go all the way back. So, I mean, you can look at Obama, you can look at Trump as a response to Obama. But for me, it was really kind of I just read the 1619 Project twice. And learning about the 1619 Project, the way that it came about and was developed into curriculum and instruction with this huge level of support for K-12, from K-12 faculty, as well as higher ed faculty, during the Trump administration, of course, created a big backlash to that. And so people started to be concerned about legislating what people are allowed to talk about in the classroom then, particularly, I think, in K-12. And then we had the pandemic and George Floyd, and the larger Black Lives Matter movement came back into fruition. And that led to universities making diversity statements, which are largely considered relatively meaningless, but it attempts to show support. And then push back against those, push back against Black Lives Matter, push back against the 1619 Project in an era where the diversity of our country is only becoming more increased. I don't know. I think we're in an environment of fear around losing power. And I think we're in an environment in which that sort of, you may want to cut this out. A friend of mine calls this the Trump death baby rattle. Like the Trump baby death rattle, right? It's like this last minute in seizing power. And one of the attacks that allows people to do that, to maintain the status quo of like sort of heteronormativity and race privilege and gender privilege and all of these things. The one of the places that they have chosen to have this fight play out is in the education system. I don't know if that answered it. I feel like I maybe went off topic, so you may want to edit some of that. But Habiba, I can let you pick it up from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question, it gets back to this question, kind of thinking more broadly about the purpose of school and the purpose of higher education to begin with, right? On the one hand, and I think that the purpose has never been so simple. It's always been complicated. But on the one hand, we can see school as the place where you go for social reproduction, right? To reproduce the class status of your, parents, where you go and you're kind of learning how to be in this society. And it's a very sort of traditional approach. And from that standpoint, the people in power are trying to protect the social order, however they see it. And so from that standpoint, if there are ideas that challenge the social order, whether it's a critique of capitalism, whether it's anti-racism, whether it's sort of gender theory, right? Though these are ideas that kind of critique the social order. And they have a home in universities precisely because of academic freedom. And so these ideas are in texts, they're in scholarship. There's no sort of censorship of ideas at the university level. And I think that scholars do not see themselves as agents of social reproduction most of the time, because they are agents of thinking, like trying to engage with ideas and texts and argumentation and all of these things. So it gets back to this question of power and social order. I mean, there's the other views that, universities are a place where naturally and historically in the liberal arts, there's in particular, whenever you're engaging with ideas, is that there's this idea that it actually doesn't produce reproduction, but it produces a sense of transformation, right? So you learn, and it's a transformative moment where you then have tools to kind of historicize or to critique or to analyze your world. And so in that moment, and I think even like the founders, even Thomas Jefferson, even like all of the people that have kind of were at the foundation of American education, the earliest people that were writing and thinking about this saw this as a space of transformation. And that kind of transformation is a part of human freedom. And so, and like being a better person because you're using your thinking, right? And so that's how they saw it. But that has always been in flux. That's always been a source of tension, right? Even with like this free speech movement in Berkeley, right? That was seen, on the one hand, we look at that as kind of this amazing moment of academic freedom, but others might look at that as an important point to sort of shut down things that are happening on college campuses. So I think that tension is at the core of this this debate, which is not just now, but I think that right now that there's been like a flare up of that tension where politicians see campuses as a target, both K-12 and higher ed. It's a lot easier to restrict K-12 than it is higher ed, but so it becomes a target.
Interesting. I studied Mario Savio in my graduate work for protest rhetoric, and the idea of putting your body on the gears and to fight that oppressive system came to mind. Is that what it's going to take for free speech to trump this idea of intimidation?
I feel like that's the history. I feel like that's what always happens. I feel that every time. I mean, I studied the civil rights movement for this project as well as for the Jewish identity book, and that I just wrote. And one of the things that you see is that any time, like if you read Foucault, anytime that you're in a situation where systemic power is attempting to quell the freedom of thought and critical thought, you are and in doing that is attempting to, really kind of legislate people into boxes and silence voices. I mean, this is muted group theory, right? Like the idea is that there are, if it's not going to happen, there have to be people who put their bodies on the line. I think that's the way that in a lot of cases that seems to be the only way to get it done, is that there are, people who are willing, and we've talked about this a little bit. Neither one of us has tenure. We're both in positions where, in putting this on, we will probably be great. We'll probably be good, right? It will probably be helpful. It's been a wonderful experience so far doing all of this work. But there is an awareness that, if you really want to fight for things like this, you have to be in a position where you understand that if that means that you're going to wind up being a scapegoat, or you're going to wind up being, an object lesson, and it's going to mean that you might lose your job or you might get in some kind of trouble, that's just part of it. That's part of protesting and advocating for important things that are going to affect, like for me, I'm doing this not just for me, but for my daughter, for all of our students at UTSA who are diverse and need to see diverse representation in their classrooms and by their educators. Like, to me, it's not even a sacrificing thing. It's a morale. I couldn't not do this. And I think Habib and I both, like, we have had this conversation more than once. It would be, knowing that this kind of thing is going on, seeing these reports about the ways that people are being intimidating. You can do legislative trackers where you can literally look at 392 pieces of legislation were floated in between 2021 and 2023 that have been designed to curb academic and or intellectual freedom. Only a handful of these have passed, but that doesn't mean they're not going to come back again smarter and get more passed in the future. And our only ways to fight against this are through, through the system, voting, the electorate, doing all of that, in which case we also need to be encouraging our students to be activists in their own right without indoctrinating them. So that's a really weird line that you have to walk. But, I just think that you can't have this kind of, and I'm hesitant to use the word democracy because I don't want to get into the anti-academic freedom argument, which is really wrapped up in patriotism, right? So the anti-academic freedom movement has been strategically situated to be an anti-patriotic argument. If you teach people to be critical of our country, then people who live in our country will not support our country, and they won't continue to vote in the status quo. And, we can't have that. And the amount of younger people who are getting so fed up with the entire system that they are choosing not to participate, unfortunately, in this case, means that this stuff is continuing to go through unless there are people who are willing to stand in front of the train. And I mean, I've already lost an academic job in the past. I know what that is like. I know that I can do that and I can get back on my feet. I would rather do what I think is important and follow my conscience for all of the other people around because I have white privilege and I have the ability to do that than just toe the line and teach what people tell me to teach. That seems like a soul-killing enterprise, to be honest. And I'm fortunate because I do have privilege. So, yeah.
I want to get to the bodies on the line comment. I mean, I think that our bodies are in the line already. And it all depends on how we frame that, make sense of that notion of this being an embodied force, right? Like it's already embodied. If we think of silence is an embodied position, right? Not speaking is embodied, right? So that means that if you're in a room and you can't express yourself or you feel nervous about how to talk about something, I think that is embodied. I also think that pushing those limits are also that's also embodied, but it's about how do you move in this space and how do you live in this world and in a space where in theory you're supposed to be free, right? And so that's an old story, right? That kind of that's an old story of people in schools where they feel like, they're not teaching my history or they're not teaching an accurate history or one that's like, reinforcing certain narrative mythologies as the truth. Many of our kids go through schools knowing that that's not the real story, right? And that's an embodied thing because that establishes your relationship with society and it sort of exposes a kind of double standard in the educational experience. And I think that that's very embodied because, we know that there's, people in classrooms and whether it's in K-12 or in higher ed, that those are spaces of identity formation, right? Of who you are in this world. It's about personhood. We have a panel in our symposium called Power, Personhood, and Academic Freedom, right? And so I think that personhood is it emerges through the body. It's not always putting yourself on the train and, in front of the train, which happens, but it's in the way we're moving through. And so, one of the things about that term, educational intimidation, is that this is something that, we're not talking about educational censorship, because there's some forms of censorship, but the real power that's happening is that people feel reluctant to express themselves. And that's what, we call that the chilling effect. And so, while, the chilling effect it's taken hold. It's taken hold, from our research and my research in K-12, from Miriam's research in higher ed. We see that this broadly, the weather has changed and the things that we talk about have officially changed. So, yeah. And I think that's an embodied experience of moving through, Texas schools, Texas public institutions. It would be a very different feeling in the body if you were in a school or in a state that had none of that, right? In New York City, they have sort of Black studies is a part of the requirement now. Like, what does it mean to be a person, whether white or Black or, Asian or whatever, to be in a school where that's the standard as opposed to this thing that's being regulated. And that has a different experience for everyone. It's not just about, sort of this charity of let's learn about the people of color. It changes the whole experience of everybody in the room. We're not doing anybody favors by hearing their stories and their history, because that's not a real representation of this world, right? This world is more complex than we'd like for it to seem. And the mythology that's kind of taken hold of the curriculum it's very problematic.
And it's damaging. It's damaging. We've lost from UTSA. I personally know 5 faculty members who have left the state. Ryan, we have a colleague with a trans daughter who is very seriously considering leaving the state. I know people who have been born and raised here who are just I cannot live here anymore. And to Habiba's point, shouldn't we have compulsory Mexican American studies in a city where our population is, our representative population is being reflected in that class? Why are we debating whether or not this is an okay thing to teach our children who are represented by these classes? And they've outlawed it in Arizona. I got my PhD in Arizona. The idea that you cannot teach Mexican American studies in Arizona, to me, is, it's deeply troubling that we are breaking up as a country into states. One of the reasons that Trinity University can host this event is because they are a private institution. And not only does that position them, to be safer to put something like this on them, we would at UTSA. We could have put this on at UTSA, but it would have been so much harder. We wouldn't have gotten the funding. It would have been really kind of difficult. But this puts Trinity in a position to be able to take up, diversity, equity, and inclusion as the university in San Antonio that does that, which is ironic because when our work group started, there were 4 of us, and Trinity, we had Incarnate Word, Northeast Lakeview, and UTSA, which are all HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, and Trinity is not. But Trinity is the one who gets to do this, right? And you're seeing this in all kinds of states. California, San Diego State University just put a bid out to hire a number of Latina faculty so that they can become the premier Hispanic serving institution for higher ed in the country. Why isn't UTSA that? We should be in the running for that, but we are not going to be able to because of this legislation. We are hobbling ourselves. And I mean, on top of that, there's also the rhetorical distinctions. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not actually a term that is tied in public knowledge all that much to concepts like critical race theory and ethnic studies. This is a newer term that in the past has been embraced in business as a commerce term, an economic term. You do DEI trainings at your corporation. And if you are like, I've got a friend who's a project manager, very high end. She gets RFPs from like counties and cities all over the place. And there are counties and cities all over blue states in the country right now who are setting up DEI offices and hiring DEI reps and making this a part of their corporate structure or their cities or counties structure because it can bring them in money, it can bring them in clients. So strategically, it's a ridiculous move as well. And yet here we are, dividing ourselves into red states and blue states. And the blue states now have opportunities to take a ball and run with it. And if you live in a red state, but you have these blue state values, but you love your red state, what are you supposed to do? Or you can't leave your red state because your family is here and you're entrenched. Then what do? How can you be an educator or have children in school or higher education when you know they're being told that the Civil War was a blip and we're past it now?
How might it be in the best interest of both parties to have this kind of freedom? Because you would think that both parties want to have intellectual freedom, freedom of speech. These seem like values that are part of what it means to be an American, to be able to speak freely.
I think that in the past, and depending on political context, they have actually. In fact, they've leveled the accusation that the left is not in favor of academic freedom and that we, through the whole discourse of cancel culture, right? Mm-hmm. So the critique of cancel culture is a critique of the way people might be shutting down speech, right? So they already do believe it. Mm-hmm. They already do believe it. It's not that they don't believe it. It's just that what ends up happening is the argument around academic freedom gets used when people don't like what's being said.
Yeah.
Right? It gets weaponized. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, and right now, they're forgot their sort of original, sort of maybe papers that were written or op-eds that were written in, maybe 5-6 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was like the right that was arguing that academic freedom is in threat, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And then because through political correctness, mm-hmm. and political correctness was seen as stifling academic freedom. And so that somehow got forgotten. That was forgotten very quickly, right after 2020. And and so it was so hypocritical, and which says to me that it was really never the principle that they were arguing, right? What they're arguing for is self-interest, it's political interest, right? And sure, people on the left do that too. We do that. I'll say we because I'm, that's what they'll call me. Whatever, despite what I might call myself, we do it too, right? Well, it happens on the left and the right where there's interest, right? And so I think that there's to be honest, the different sides have a different vision of the world, right? And when that vision of the world is seen to be under attack, mm-hmm. then there's actions that take place, and one of those actions is to kind of argue against what's being said as somehow being in opposition to something else. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the right. I mean, and it's not even that long ago, right? I mean, that's the thing with media culture, internet, the news cycle. It's it wasn't even that long ago that they were the ones that were saying that academic freedom is under threat. It's like if you just change the year, put the same conference together, it would have a It could have been something that was put on by the right, actually.
Yeah.
That, you know?
It's really interesting too, because yeah, I was talking about this in my grad class the other night. One of the things that happens with all of this is strategic rhetoric, right? So, terminology is being used on both, this is part of politics and legislation. And like an example, I'm trying to think, of course, my ADHD thought just flew out of my head. But like an example of this is very recently, there was this whole idea of like liberal snowflakes and getting offended by everything, right? So if I am a snowflake, then I am a white woman who is going to be offended if you say anything against anybody who, is not white. I'm going to get all up in nerves and all kerfuffled and everything. And now there is this term that I've been writing about called viewpoint diversity. And what viewpoint diversity is, if you want to talk about a legal term that's being weaponized, that sounds like one thing, but is actually another. Viewpoint diversity is not the idea that we should all be allowed to have diverse viewpoints and we can maybe in our university classrooms, with an ethic of care, debate these viewpoints. No, that's not what this means. What viewpoint diversity is it's the concept that has been written into this legislation. It began with Ron DeSantis in 2021. He got legislation passed that promotes viewpoint diversity in K-12, I think, education in Florida in 2022. And then it showed up in the 88th legislative session. And what viewpoint diversity means is I don't want to hear anything that might make me insecure about my viewpoint. So if your viewpoint is different from mine, you need to keep it to yourself, because I might feel uncomfortable with what you say. So if you say, the ripple effects of the Civil War and Reconstruction are still being felt today, maybe even at, potentially higher numbers or at higher levels than it has over the last couple of decades, I hear that and I go, oh my God, you're saying I'm a racist. And then I get upset and offended by that. Viewpoint diversity is designed to protect me and the possible offense I might take to you as a professor, a teacher, or a student telling me something I don't agree with. How does that fit in with the snowflake argument of getting super offended really, really easily? I don't know, because they seem to be, really the same argument being put out by the same side. But on one hand, it's against me for being a snowflake and being too impacted and too empathetic to the plight of, other non-dominant group members. Or is it that I don't want to offend a dominant group member by explaining to them that there are things that might be problematic? And again, this goes back to this idea of this sort of false idea of indoctrination of our students, right? That if we have the ability to teach them to think critically, the misunderstanding comes is when we're teaching our students to think critically, we are not telling them what to critique. We are just telling them to take information in a way in which you are aware that there's multiple sides. You need to understand how all of these things work, and you need to understand that not all ideas that show up in print or online are necessarily true, right? Or they're necessarily the only truth. Somehow that ability to think critically has been twisted around into being not an ability to think critically, but an indoctrination into the idea that white people are all individually racist, and therefore, people of color are always trying to take white people down for being racist, or what you can add in gender, you can add in sexual orientation, you can add in all different kinds of difference into this mix. But yeah, it's just this idea of like, who's going to be offended? Yeah. How did that get flipped around so quickly? And it was fast. As Habiba said, like, the conversations that were, the snowflake and the woke conversation and all of that. I mean, these things were like 2017, 18, 19, 20. This is recent. And it is really interesting, I think, the way that it
Well,
goes.
I think it's, I mean, okay, getting back to what people should know. I think that, it's really simple to say, oh, which is what I said before, which is like, yes, the left does it, the right doesn't, both sides do it. But I think that the techniques and way we do things is a little different. Like, it's this question of how did it all of a sudden change, right? I thought you guys were so interested in academic freedom and now you're trying to shut it down. Well, it doesn't all happen because of community organizing, right? It's not like, oh, everybody, all the parents in the red states are up in arms about the books. No, it's not something that happens from the ground up. And the thing that bothers me a little bit is that this is like, it's not all in good faith. There's foundations, right? The Manhattan Institute. There are conservative foundations that put millions of dollars into into kind of producing and circulating the rhetoric, which is why you're like, well, how does that happen so fast? It happens through campaigns, right, that are made to appear as though they are they're coming from the ground up, right? And even sort of architects of these campaigns, like to name Chris Rufo, who names himself. He's like, yes, I've been very successful in crafting the rhetoric that's been then taken up by Trump, that's then been, taken up by lots of people, both left, and I think the most recent, the Claudine Gay resignation, is an example of where his rhetoric and his framework is taken up by the right and the left at times. It's all funded, and there's a machinery that puts it through Manhattan Institute and others, where it gets picked up by the American Legislative Exchange Council and and model legislation gets created, which is why the laws in Texas are so similar to the laws in Georgia. There's model language that does not necessarily come from debates on the Capitol floor. It's like the language is given to legislators, and then the legislators take it up and then make it law. So it's a complicated political process.
Can we speak a little bit about how that Claudine Gay resignation might be an example of the tension in this issue, and how, for example, one set of values sees that event a very different way than the other side?
I think that the Claudine Gay example is like a confluence of these two different interests around the question of campus speech, right? And those two different interests are sort of the discussion of Palestine on college campuses, and all this sort of challenging of diversity hiring practices, right? Because Claudine Gay was the first Black president of Harvard, Black woman, and there was a lot of criticism that she was like diversity hire, and there have been a lot of forces kind of trying to push back against this hire. The issue of Palestine, I mean, I'm a Muslim woman. I study Muslim communities, and academic freedom around Palestine, I mean, forget it, right? It's like an old story where people speaking on Palestine have had to face consequences, right? Many people have lost positions. I know even on my campus, there's just a lot of brouhaha about the fact that there was even a panel on Palestine, which ended up happening on November 1st at Barnard on the same day. Which is in New York, which is a liberal place. There was a panel on Palestine that was scheduled for the same day, and that could just not happen. You couldn't even have the panel on Palestine. So, I mean, that's an old story where there is historic academic suppression from student voice and from faculty voice when critiquing the state of Israel on college campuses. And so what we see, and that has definitely ramped up post October 7th, but it was not just October 7th, right? In at UPenn, there was a Palestine Literature Festival, which was before October 7th, which got a lot. There was a lot of controversy just by having Palestinian writers organize an event. And in fact, there's an article on October 6th in The Nation that was talking about this event as a form of educational intimidation around Palestine. And of course, that was before October 7th. And then after October 7th, the narrative of academic freedom has really centered around this issue, Palestine. But the Claudine Gay resignation, I think, is a confluence of those issues. And it kind of also represents where both there was like bipartisan support for the suppression of this speech, because you have you have like an Obama donor, and I don't remember his name, but he is the one that was kind of behind the call for Claudine Gay to resign. And he's like a Harvard donor, right? So it's like it's really easy for us to sit here and be like, oh, well, this is all just like a right-wing attack and those terrible right-wing people that are suppressing speech. But there's on this particular issue, this is right and left, and I think that it really makes me get back to this question of this principle, that we need to go back to the principle. Sometimes that principle is uncomfortable for a lot of people. It is an uncomfortable principle, and I question it all the time. Like the position on bringing people who it's confusing, right? What do we allow? What do we not allow? But I think that we believe in a world the world that I believe in can only happen if we push for the freedom to name things, to talk about things. I don't want to be a victim of that silencing. I want to use that principle to be able to push for the true, for what I think is true and real.
Ideas that might be controversial or that you don't like should still be a part of the academic freedom conversation.
It's a part of it, it's a part of it. I mean, we have to respect the principle, but I also think, there's principles and there's people, right? There's the people, right? Sometimes when there's harm, when there's like a lot of harm for the ideas that are being said, I think that we need to there's a conversation that we need to have, I think people are more important than principles. But I think that people should push, if sometimes people are harmed from not being able to say what they believe, right? Sometimes people want to say what they believe because they want to harm others. I think people are definitely more important than principles, but I think sometimes people need to be able to speak to when there's harm. And I don't think it's always easy, but I think that's why we need to talk to each other and hear from each other. And I think that's part of the goal of this panel, to be able to we want it to be generative, right?
I agree. I mean, I think one of the things we were talking about this morning in our non-DEIJ, whatever we are now in our meeting, is that one of the things that this kind of legislation does, and that I think a lot of, anti-equity and inclusion in particular, I like those terms, is that it's, and Ryan, I think you probably heard me talk about this when you interviewed me for the book, but the idea is that it is trying to break people apart and keep people from collaborating and connecting and coalition building with one another. And so what we are, one of the big goals that we had for putting together this symposium was, we realized, we all found each other. Our original group, like I said, was with faculty member from Incarnate Word, and then a faculty member from Northeast Lakeview. And we all found each other because this was an area that we were all interested in, and we were all working on it separately. And we were like, well, you know, if there's 4 women all working on, and, 2 of us were looking at it in higher ed and 2 were looking at it in K-12. And we were like, well, if we're all looking at this, there's certainly other people in our area. Just because we are in a quote unquote red state does not mean that we are in a desert, right? Like we have, I went to an AAUP conference in September, and there were people from all over the state, zoomed into this conference. There were a lot of people involved. People are interested and engaged with what they are able to teach and learn and what other people are able to teach and learn. But what you find, I think, is that on the ground, and another thing that was an issue here was, the anti-CRT legislation, right? So Senate Bill 3, which was passed in the 87th session, was the CRT ban in K-12. And they attempted to do that in SB 16 in higher ed, right? But they changed the wording. So rather than specifically talking about critical race theory, they turned the wording into DEI. And there's many reasons for that. But I think that one of the things that was a problem with using critical race theory is that A, they were using it incorrectly, and B, as a concept, it was something that most people didn't really seem to grasp or understand, other than that they were supposed to think it's bad and scary for various reasons, and without actually fully understanding how it works. And I think, again, what those kinds of arguments are designed to do is keep us in our silos, keep us from communicating with one another, and keep us from any kind of a recognition that there are most likely other people around us with similar beliefs and who are passionate enough about it to be conducting research on it, making it part of their, work life, as well as home life and teaching life and personal life and all of those things. And so the ability for us to be able to be in conversation with each other, can demystify process, because part of educational intimidation is the mystification process. Ryan, I don't know if you've tried to read any of these bills, but they are made in language that is not only difficult to parse out, it's boring as hell to read. And when you try to read them, there isn't these edited versions with strike-through lines and all of this mess. It's like they've been made almost inaccessible. And that is strategic because of the idea that it's the uncertainty. That's what educational intimidation is about. It is about leaning in to making people feel nervous and scared without clearly explaining what will happen if people do which things, A, B, and C. There's no specific layout of this. And the reason for that is that if you keep it vague and obfuscated, it's like the tenure process. It's like so much in academia. We do this too. If you keep it confusing, then people get anxious. And we know uncertainty reduction theory, right? And when people get too anxious, they leave. And they do it of their own volition. And that's the intimidation factor.
I'd like to ask about the consequence of not having dialogue between people who have different ideas, different faiths, different values. What is the consequence and the chilling effect on dialogue that is happening right now with the intimidation that you describe around academic freedom?
I think dialogue is important. I think it's interesting. I think it's essential. I think sometimes there's a prerequisite for dialogue before dialogue can really happen. And actually not prerequisite. I think that we need to think about power in relation to dialogue. I mean, the term dialogue itself presumes that there are these two equal parties that can speak to each other. But I think that there's never real dialogue when there is a power differential.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's really important to situate dialogue, because it's hard to have dialogue when you feel like what you say is framed by the person in the room. And so I think that that's really hard when we're in a moment like now. I think it can be very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
There's no dialogue in a civil war. And so, but we're not there yet. People talk about how we're like, there's so much polarization. But so I think it's really important to find like, there's this expectation that, oh yeah, we're all just going to talk to each other and it's going to get along. Well, why does that not always happen? The question of why does that not happen? And I think it is about a power differential. And I think it's about trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can have dialogue where there's trust. And in order to have trust, there has to be relationships. And I think relationships have to be nurtured alongside this goal as a part of the goal for dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that when things are less tense, it's easier to have dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And some things are not tense, like obviously, like, yeah, I mean, I think that there's always situations where some people might not be comfortable in talking. I mean, I say this like I teach at Trinity is a lot smaller than UTSA. So we have these very small classes and, we read these very compelling texts and we want to get people to talk about the texts and the ideas. And I often notice that the first year students, most occasions, they're like really reluctant to share their ideas. And I'm like, why aren't you guys talking? This is a place where you should express yourself, your ideas. And they're like, we just got here. We don't want to lose the possibility of friends by being too open. And so I think like dialogue has to go along with cultivating good relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that comes first. And I think in this, like people can have conversation. There's certain people that you can talk to, but you can't talk to everybody about some of these stuff. I'm saying this like as a person of color, somebody who's been minoritized. People have been, I feel like in many ways, almost trying to get even me as a human being, let's just have dialogue. And I'm like, okay, if that makes you happy, then we'll have the dialogue. And then we'll do the dialogue. And I'm like, okay, you feel better about yourself. I don't necessarily feel better about myself, but you seem to think that we've achieved something. And I'll let you believe that because I think this relationship is important right now. But I don't trust that this is always going to go the way it needs to go. We've seen this in the Muslim community for years. And so that's why, like, it's complicated depending on who you talk to. I'm just being really honest now. I'm older. I've seen things for a while. I think it's a good idea, but I think that can only happen under certain circumstances.
Yeah. And I think the importance of, facilitated dialogue is also something to be aware of too. Just because you put people in a room together doesn't mean that they're going to be able to talk to each other or know how to talk to each other or care to talk to each other. There's got to be, we have spent a lot of time very intentionally trying to plan out the agenda for this event because the flow of the event, the kinds of people who are involved in the different panels, the, kind of audience that we may be getting, you can't just get into a room and say, okay, let's all talk about this. Let's all academic freedom. It's a topic. Let's figure it out. That's like, there's an intentionality that needs to be coming out here. And without that intentionality, everything can devolve quite quickly. I mean, into, I really like what you said, Habiba. There's no dialogue in a civil war. We have to be able to listen and speak and have room to listen and speak. And there is not people, I don't think, naturally give that kind of room, especially when tensions are high and there's a lot of anxiety. And right now we are that's why we chose to call it an era of academic intimidation, or an era of educational intimidation, because we are in an era in which people are feeling nervous and itchy and like they've got to move, but they don't know how. And that kind of fear can create that I feel like fear and uncertainty, which comes from this intimidation without like actual concrete messages, is what can often lead dialogue into just monologues and silencing some at the expense of others. And that's not what we should be doing.
What listening skills might they need to bring? What kind of intention should they hold as they come to this event, especially if maybe there's someone who might not be welcome at an event like this?
The attitude that I have going into this event is to just try to shut my mouth and listen as much as possible. And to, give people the space that it takes to grapple with a lot of these issues. So the way that I would be preparing myself is it's very hard for me not to jump in, talk, and get engaged. But in this case, I think learning about other people's stories and finding out other people's perspectives, we're really working hard to sort of create a holistic understanding and demystification of all of this. And so I think we're going to get a fair amount of people who are going to come in with their minds made up about how they feel about things. Because we have a flyer and we're putting together a program and we're getting this little bit of publicity, I think we said in the flyer to join us for a symposium covering, and it says that this symposium is designed to begin the complex process of demystifying academic and intellectual freedom in education. And I think if that's the case, then people just need to, or people who are coming hopefully will have open minds and interests in collaboration. But I don't think you can dictate how people are going to enter into this space either. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to tell you that.
One thing they have to have in their mind is why. Like, why academic freedom? And I do think that, like, Kyle Gillette, who is at Trinity recently, kind of posed that question. And it seems so obvious, but I feel like the more I think about it, the more complex that answer becomes. Mm-hmm. It's like, why and what? What are we fighting for? Why? And also to kind of be open to kind of, again, like I said before, this is a generative symposium. Like, how do they see this in terms of why and what are the boundaries? Are there boundaries? Is this limitless? When do you fight for the principle? When do you fight, what is this relationship between principle and people? Mm-hmm. I think those are two questions to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for being here. Tell us where we can find more information online.
There's a flyer, and on the flyer, we'll send that to you, and hopefully you can make that available on your link, right? And on the flyer, there's a QR code and a link that will have the agenda available.